Okay, this is the podcast, the second one for macromolecules. However, this podcast is only going to cover the carbohydrates. Another podcast will cover proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So for carbohydrates, if you look at the word carb, and then there's an O in there, and then there's a hydrate, and that might help you remember what a carbohydrate is. So they are organic compounds, which means they contain hydrogen and carbon. And actually they contain oxygen as well. Carbon, hydrate is referring to the hydrogen, and then that O is referring to the oxygen. So it's actually in a ratio of a 1 to 2 to 1, of 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens and then to 1 oxygen. So there's always going to be double hydrogens to the carbons and the oxygens. That applies to the small, simple carbohydrates. Typically it's a ring-shaped structure. You might see some diagrams where it's not, but typically for us, they will be in a ring-shaped structure, and you will see examples in a few minutes. And when you think of a carbohydrate, you want to think of a sugar. Okay. So they are a source of energy, but they also can be used as a structural material for organisms. All right, so here's some examples of some monosaccharides or carbohydrates. We'll get into what a monosaccharide is in a minute, but you notice that there's carbon in all of them, there's hydrogens in all of them, and there's an oxygen, or multiple oxygen, sorry, in all of them. So if there's 3 carbons, like in this aldose, 3 carbons, there's going to be 3 oxygens, so that number is equal. And then the hydrogens are double. So if there's 3 carbons, there's going to be 6 hydrogens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that applies to all simple sugars. Okay, so there are 3 types of carbohydrates. The first one is called a monosaccharide. Saccharide means sugar. Mono means 1. So that means it is just 1 simple molecule of a sugar. The main example is glucose. So it is a monomer, which is a small unit of a big carbohydrate. So this is glucose. It is C6H12O6 is an example of a monosaccharide. So in glucose, you can see that there are 6 carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they're in a ring. You don't need to know this. This is AP Bio, but this would be carbon number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the 6th carbon is off the ring. Oxygens, there's also 6, so those numbers are equal, and then there would be double the hydrogens, and you can count them up and verify that there are 12 of them. There are 3 common, well, there's more than 3, but there's 3 common ones that we're going to learn that are monosaccharides. Glucose, and that's the main energy that's in our cells. You have fructose, which is a sugar in fruit, so it's super sweet. And then you have the sugar that's in milk, and that is called galactose. All 3 of these monosaccharides are C6H12O6. Here they are by shape. So you can see they look similar. They're all in a ring-shaped structure, but they're all different. But if you look, well, you don't know organic chemistry, but these corners here are assuming that there's a carbon there. So that's why you don't see all of the atoms in this. But there's glucose, fructose, and galactose. Those are called monosaccharides. It is a 1 sugar molecule. There are 2 kinds of glucose. There's an alpha glucose and a beta glucose. If you look at the structure, the only difference is where this OH hydroxyl, remember that from our functional groups, it's where that is located on carbon 1. And in alpha glucose, the hydroxyl is pointing downward, or the hydroxyl group is below. And in beta glucose, the hydroxyl group is pointing upward. Okay. Second type of carbohydrate is called a disaccharide. Saccharide again means sugar, di means 2. So if you look at the picture here, there are 2 sugars and they are bonded together by a covalent bond. So there are 2 monosaccharides bonded together. This is done by a condensation reaction, which means water was removed, that we learned in section 1. Here are 3 examples. If you take a fructose and a galactose, a fructose and a glucose, which is what the picture's showing actually right here, that is called sucrose, and that's table sugar. So you have sucrose at home right now, your sugar that you would add to your coffee, or for example. A galactose and a glucose makes lactose, and I'm sure you've heard of lactose. That's the sugar in milk, the disaccharide in milk. And then if you take 2 glucose molecules and bond those together, that makes the sugar in malts, which is called maltose. If you haven't caught on, all sugars There's an exception. A lot of the sugars, I should say, end in OSE. Sucrose, lactose, maltose, glucose, fructose. Okay. So here is a chemical reaction showing a glucose molecule and another glucose molecule. And remember, they're going to bond together by condensation reaction. So this water is going to be removed. So one of the sugars is going to lose the OH, the other sugar is going to lose an H. Those H2O come together and that forms water. And now we have this covalent bond linking the two glucoses together. And a glucose plus a glucose makes a maltose. Okay, the last type of carbohydrates or group of them are called polysaccharides. Poly means many, so many sugars. It is a very complex molecule. It can be composed of 20 or more, I'm talking like hundreds of monosaccharides bonded together. So they have the sugar molecules, and you can see that like this is multiplied by N, which means that number could be, like I said, hundreds. Okay, there are 4 examples of polysaccharides. Glycogen, so we're going to go through each one of these. Starch, cellulose, we're not going to do it in this order though, and chitin. So you need to know the differences between these 4 polysaccharides. All right, first one is cellulose. So you can see cellulose is also called fiber, which you might have heard about in your diet, that you're supposed to have fiber in your diet. And then here is the chemical structure of cellulose. So cellulose is actually an alternating alpha, beta glucoses bonded together. So it's just glucose bonded to glucose, bonded to glucose, bonded to glucose hundreds and hundreds of times. But it's an alpha, beta, and alternates when they bond together. It is linear, as you can see in the picture. There's no branching, which some of the other types of polysaccharides will have branching. And plants make it. It's part of their cell structure called the cell wall, which we'll learn about in our next unit. And it makes plants very strong. And that is what fiber is, and we can't digest it. All right, the next polysaccharide that we're going to learn about is called starch. So here's cellulose down at the bottom. And see, you got an alpha pointing downward, beta, alpha, beta. But now we're going to do starch. So it's a little bit different. Notice it's alpha, 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 alpha. This orientation of this is a little bit different than originally what I showed you what an alpha glucose is. All right, so starch. Starch are hundreds and hundreds of alpha glucoses bonded together. And this is how plants, this is found in plants, store their glucose. So glucose is stored as starch in a plant. There's 2 kinds of starch. You can see here on the left, you got amylopectin and you have amylose. What's the difference? You can see amylose is linear. I mean, and it's helical, but it's linear. There's no branches at all. Okay, it's just a single glucose unit, hundreds of those alpha glucoses bonded together, and it forms this helical shape. Where amylopectin is not like that. It has branching. So you're going to have, you know, like maybe 3 here and then another 6 or whatever, but you can see it has branches. So amylopectin is branched and amylose is not. Okay, our next polysaccharide is called glycogen. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but here's a picture of it, and you can see it's super, super branched. So it is also an alpha glucose bonded together. So it's similar to starch, except it is way more branched than amylopectin or amylose. Or amylose isn't branched at all. It's way more branched than amylopectin. And this is animals' version of storage. We do this in our liver. We store glucose in our liver. And so if you took a little piece of liver, put it under the microscope, electron microscope, you would see glycogen molecules. So here's a picture of glycogen, and here's a picture of the 2 starches. Amylose, again, is linear, and eventually will be helical, but amylopectin is branched, but look, glycogen is more branched. Okay, remember these 2 are types of starch, and glycogen is glycogen. All right, the last one, well, before we do that, here's another picture. Cellulose, remember, is linear, but it's alpha, beta, alpha, beta. Starch is only alpha and branched. Well, if this one must be amylopectin pictured there, and then glycogen is super branched. Our last one is called chitin, and I have a picture here of different organisms that you would find chitin in. It is similar to cellulose in that there's alternating alpha beta glucoses bonded together, but the difference between chitin and cellulose is there is a nitrogen compound connected to it. with that nitrogen compound that's in there that's bonded makes it super stronger than cellulose. Cellulose is really strong in a plant cell. Chitin is even stronger. And you would find chitin in the exoskeleton of insects. So when you like step on a bug, whatever, you hear that crunch sound, that is chitin. That is the exoskeleton. That's what it's made of. Okay. So here is chitin. So you have alternating alpha beta, don't worry about that. But what you're looking for is this, see this nitrogen? No other polysaccharide has this nitrogen compound here. And don't worry about these names or anything. But that's what you're going to be looking for in diagrams, is you're looking for a nitrogen, because typically carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen only, except for chitin. Chitin is the only example of a carbohydrate that will have a nitrogen compound attached to it. All right, so here is cellulose. Okay, there's no nitrogen in there. Look, chitin's very similar, but there's an N right there. Nitrogen is N. And so there's some type of nitrogen compound bonded to one of the carbons on the glucose. And that finishes carbohydrates.